The Japan of the 1960s was a tumultuous place. A country still reeling from its defeat in the Second World War was experiencing seismic societal changes. Almost overnight, Japan had gone from an isolated, deeply traditional and autocratic society to a democracy under American occupation. Post-war occupation didn't just bring the US Army, however. Crucially, it brought Western cultural influences. Though Japan had opened up to the outside world during the Meiji era towards the end of the 19th century, this was nothing compared to the flood of cultural fusion post-1945. Japan now embraced American popular culture, which included, importantly for this video, cinema. And experiencing this cultural melting pot firsthand was a writer with the pen name Yukio Mishima. Mishima has become infamous for his later writings and eventual death by ritual suicide, but that's a whole topic of discussion for another day. But at the turn of the 1960s, he was a much celebrated figure in Japanese literary circles. Already an authoritative presence in the field of traditional theatre, it was around this time that Mishima made his first forays into film. His on-screen breakthrough came as the protagonist in Yasuzo Masamura's Yakuza film, Afraid to Die, released in 1960. In it, he plays Takeo, a young Yakuza gangster who attempts to escape his life of crime after being released from prison. It was Mishima's experience of this starring role that led to the writing of a novella about the film industry and fame itself, and he titled it Star. Star is written in first person from the perspective of Rikyo, nicknamed Richie by his fans, a young up-and-coming movie star in Tokyo. Though Mishima was already well into his mid-30s by the time he filmed Afraid to Die, a common theme in his writing is his personal identification with youth, and young men in particular. Given this and the context which led Mishima to write Star, it's difficult not to see Rikyo as his own self-insert. This doesn't mean that the book is necessarily an autobiography. In fact, some elements of it maintain a sense of heightened reality that borders on dramatic. However, it's important to understand Star as a definite product of the unique voice that created it. It's probably just as reflective of Mishima's eccentricities as of the Japanese film industry of the 60s, if not more so. The book is split into 5 unnamed chapters, and though the story's time span isn't explicitly stated, its events likely take place over no more than a few weeks. And it begins on set. I glanced into my assistant's little mirror at the crowd that had gathered in the street. Rikyo is getting ready for a take of a scene during filming. It's a hot day in May, and the streets around the set are thronging with his fans screaming in adoration. They're all wearing a uniform, a specific style of outfit that Rikyo claims as his own design, but is more likely a product of the studio. My reflection was boyish and alive, but all the energy was in the makeup. He describes the relentlessness of life as an actor. He's worked for days on end for the last 6 months with barely any sleep. This is immensely detrimental to his health, but he doesn't care. Forward thinking is something for the real world. Everyone else. It's useless to him. I had no more use for dreams. Dreaming was for the moviegoers, fingering their pulpy paper tickets. Not for me. Rikyo has an aside about meeting fans at fan clubs. They always ask him what it's like to be a movie star. He's always amazed by the number of ugly girls at these fan clubs, disdainfully saying that sometimes they even have cripples. He reads his script, which is marked meticulously with red ink by the director, and practices his line in the mirror. He's been using American eye drops to rid his eyes of the signs of sleep deprivation. My eyes were clear and sharp, in line with the cheap nihilism of a young Yakuza. The mirror is suddenly filled with the face of Rikyo's assistant, Keo. She is in her 30s but looks more like her 40s. She has silver front teeth and her hair is messy. She has no regard for her appearance.
While she let on that she was a moron quite convincingly and pretended not to get things, KO was in fact my accomplice, my partner in this artifice. To be honest, she was probably the better actor.
And here we see Rikyo's true relationship with KO.
I saw the moon in KO's silver teeth. When she laughed in the dark, they flashed like tabs of moonlight. Sometimes I had to touch them to be sure of what they were, and felt better for confirming they were fakes.
KO is both the architect behind his career and his only confidant. He says that they first started sleeping together after she soothed him when he broke down crying from a grueling week of filming. They have an intimacy that he says requires no emotion. The two are in on the same joke, as he describes it. They spend their time together mocking the world around them. Their intimate time together is spent in Rikyo's bedroom, which is the only real freedom he gets during a day. The two of them take pleasure in the fact that there is nothing remotely natural or even plausible about the relationship. They love the satisfaction of deceiving the world, and they keep it completely secret. Because she doesn't care about her looks, KO is somewhat immune to jealousy. In the bedroom, she reads a cutout from a magazine, an interview Rikyo gave about his ideal woman. Slim and young with perfect ankles. She mocks this by exaggeratedly comparing herself to that image. As Rikyo kisses her, she says,
"You'll always be my handsome little prince, even when you're 60.
Back to set, and they're shooting in a busy suburban neighborhood with a railway track running over the street. It's the middle of the day, but all the shops and bars are closed for filming, and the faces of the inhabitants are pressed against the windows to watch. Rikyo passes the director, who's hunched behind the camera.
He was lanky, skeletal, and had a long hyperactive nose and a tiny little mouth. His whole face was darkened from incessant exposure to the brutal world of dreams.
He gives Rikyo a set of directions. He's to walk down the street, kicking a tin can along the road, and then deliver his line, before gazing ahead, squinting in annoyance as a train passes by. Rikyo says that while filming, which is virtually all he does in life, he sees nothing as nature.
The scenery is no more than a dense collection of objects. Alluring forests or mesmerizing temples separate into their various constituents, with every scene a garbage dump of information, another miscellaneous wild heap of things that are cold, or dark, or twinkling, or stagnant, a confusion of unmanageable shapes.
After some practice takes, the director berates Rikyo for not squinting in exactly the right way he requires. He describes the feeling that an actor feels while being criticized as a lonely expanse, but still enveloped in his role, he's shielded from reality still.
Even if the director lost his temper and threw a punch at me, his fist would swim through unreal air and never actually hit me.
They go to film the real take, and Rikyo describes the very fabric of his world changing as the camera's film whirs into life.
Now I could be seen completely. Being seen made me their king. It gave me my authority, and all the people watching were my subjects.
Countless eyes crowd all round his vision as he takes the form of this Yakuza. Many delicate movements are crammed into just a few seconds with no scope for mistakes. Rikyo compares it to an IQ test he had to take during school, performing a great many menial actions in sequence. He walks forward, kicks the can, delivers the line, and looks up at the train. The director calls to cut and shouts, "Okay." When the director isn't satisfied, the "okay" can barely leave his throat. This time, it sounds alright.
The tension dissipated. When I sauntered back over to the folding chair that KO pushed towards me, the crowd rejoiced like I'd just returned from a war.
He collapses back into his chair and KO brings him some tea. He feels like his body is falling apart from the lack of sleep. His fans scream from the side of the street for autographs. He smiles and waves from his chair.
Their shrill voices splashed over me like rancid oil. If only I could line them up and march them all into the mouth of an incinerator. except they probably crawl out of the ashes gawking at me, so I'd have to pluck their eyes out first.
For a moment, he loses control and yawns, causing a fresh set of screams from the fans. He struggles to think which scenes they've already shot and which they have to do that day, but the little he remembers is already beginning to fade. The first chapter of Star drops us right into Rikyo's shoes, and the centre of the action of a film actor's life. It's no coincidence that our very first introduction to him is through a mirror. Rikyo has a constant obsession with seeing and being seen, which is understandable with the attention and scrutiny given to his every movement. This has made him somewhat detached from reality. The cost of this way of living is also immediately apparent. He takes drastic measures to hide his desperate exhaustion from the world around him. Chapter 1 also crucially introduces us to Keo. It's a key detail that the mirror through which Rikyo is studying himself belongs to her, and that she appears accompanying him in it. She's the only person in the world that occupies Rikyo's internal world with him, or perhaps she's the architect of that world. It's certainly surprising and incongruous for an explicitly described ugly and lowly assistant to have this intimate relationship with one of the most desirable and handsome film stars in the industry. It says something of Rikyo's detachment from normal human connection, that the basis of this intimacy is the fact that it's one big spiteful deception of the world at large. But as will become clearer through the rest of the story, the extent to which he's an equal partner in their relationship is open to interpretation. At least I think so. The flow of unreal time, or the way Rikyo's experience of the world comes into sharp focus only in front of the camera, is also introduced to us here. Outside of the confines of fiction, existence is just an atomized series of random objects and meaningless faces to him, and taking the form of a character and living in false realities is his only escape. The few simple actions he takes are dragged out and seem extraordinarily significant, despite the shot only lasting a few seconds. It really might as well be his entire world. And once the take is done, he must go back to his ordinary reality, where, ironically, the gaze on him is not necessarily any less intense than in front of the camera. His fans' shrill screaming irritates him, and this is understandable, but his thoughts turn shockingly dark and violent. He's not just annoyed by these fans, but despises them. His fantasy of marching them into an incinerator belies both his belief that he holds complete, godlike power over them, and the first hints of his fascination with death, as a result of his detachment from reality. The second chapter takes us back to Rikyo's bedroom, where Keo is sorting through his fan letters and characteristically mocking them. She does a mocking impression of an actress Rikyo had kissed for a scene. He suddenly remembers that tomorrow is his 24th birthday. Keo says that she's sent invitations to some of his college friends to come to dinner, but he shouldn't hold out any hope of getting home from set in time to join them. On set the next day, Rikyo affirms this. It's becoming clear that they'll be shooting long into the night. However, he does not ask Keo to inform his parents of his absence.
If anticipating my arrival was part of the festivities, then surely my absence was part of the feast. That's right. It's better for a star to be completely absent. No matter how serious the obligation, a star is more of a star if he never arrives. Absence is his forte. The question of whether he'll show up gives the event a ceaseless undercurrent of suspense, but a true star never arrives.
Rikyo goes on to explain an unusual occurrence during filming that night. The scenes between him, the young Yakuza, and an actress named Neriko, his love interest in the film. It entails his final goodbye to her as he goes off to confront his nemesis and face his death. He says there are countless films like this one, and the scene is so formulaic that we've probably seen it before, but he can't help but feel that such a story always has a certain charm.
The Yakuza with his simplistic attitude towards death, and the pretty woman who resists him, hiding her true feelings, are bearers of a special kind of vulgar, trifling poetry, a hidden poetry that will be lost if any mediocrity is shed. Genius is a casualty.
They go to take the shot, the director shouts action, and the camera starts rolling. He steps out into the facade of the fictional town and is struck by an uncanny feeling, quite unlike anything he's felt while filming before. He feels a strange connection to this unreal place, and truly thinks he's experiencing what it's like to see the world through the eyes of someone resolved to die.
The piercing fidelity of the landscape must have meant that I was watching from the gates of death. What I saw was as comprehensive as a memory, poor and wretched as a memory, as quiet as fluorescent. I was putting it together in the way you would before you die, a last attempt to connect the life flashing before you with an acute vision of the future. I let the neon wash over me, knowing this was something I could never see again.
As he's in this trance, the door to one of the facades swings open, and he's faced with a beautiful young woman. Rikyo knows this is not part of the scene. In the flow of unreal time in front of the camera, he usually expects everything to proceed to the plan, but this unplanned intrusion only heightens his feeling of connection to the fictional world. She's partly shadowed, and of her face he can only see a pair of lips and sad eyes. In this moment, he says,
I completely forgot about acting, and fell head over heels in love with this mysterious beauty.
She runs towards him and shouts his name, Richie. Not his character's name, but his real name. As she wraps her arms around him, the director shouts to cut, and the entire crew bursts into anger. Rikyo says that later, some older members of the crew explained the bizarre spectacle. The girl was an aspiring actress, who'd worked herself into a nervous breakdown trying to make it big. She'd decided her only way into a starring role was some sort of publicity stunt, like this one. Strangely, she is vindicated in this. The director's anger doesn't last, and gaining some kind of inspiration from her, he writes her into the scene as a crazy girl who inexplicably runs to embrace the young Yakuza, while his love interest watches from the doorway. The girl reveals that her name is Yuri, and the crew move to film this new version of the scene.
Yuri was petrified and tightened up. Her arms and legs were stiff, as if caught in plaster. I absorbed the icy glares they cast upon this actress, who had overstepped her bounds. Yuri's body would not regain the fluid liberty of that moment. That sense of living realness, felt only once, was gone for good.
They try a couple more takes, but it's clear she isn't up to it. The producer escorts her off set, the blood drained from her face. She turns to glance at Rikyo, but he ignores her. Filming finishes late, and Rikyo finds that Yuri was still hanging around the green room refusing to go home. The actors are struck with panic as they realize she's snuck into one of the dressing rooms and overdosed on something.
Still wearing my costume and makeup, I charged over to her. Ko, who loves this sort of chaos, had beat me there.
They find she's taken a heavy dose of Valimin, lay her down and call a doctor. Quite quickly, the doctor tells them that she'll be alright, but he needs some of the crew to hold her down while he gives her a saline injection. She cries out in pain as she comes back to consciousness.
Ko looked my way, and just for an instant let a smirk show at the corner of her mouth.
That night, in Rikyo's bedroom, Ko does another mocking impression, this time of Yuri convulsing. They both laugh to the point of delirium. The next morning, the studio's PR office has worked the story of Yuri's attempted suicide into a romantic tragedy. A young actress in love with Rikyo tried to take her own life, as she couldn't be with him, but his heroic intervention saved her life. The studio's statement says,
To preserve the beauty of this memory, she'd given up acting for good.
The second chapter introduces the first intruder into Rikyo's insulated inner world in Yuri, the young actress. She's a ripple in the fabric of the mundanity of Rikyo's life. Her interruption comes just after he explains the formulaic and mediocre nature of these Yakuza films, that they are predictable and artless, that we've seen them 1,000 times before. In the moment he sees Yuri, when the cameras are rolling, she does not break his sense of immersion in the fictional world, even though he knows she's not part of the plan. He says that he falls completely in love with her in that moment, perhaps because it's only in that setting that Rikyo is able to experience anything resembling normal human feeling anymore. It's important to remember that Rikyo is also our narrator. He's the one recounting this memory. Perhaps his description of himself walking out into the set and feeling a sense of perfect unreality, of deep connection to this fictional world, just before seeing Yuri, is coloured by the fact that he's only able to rationalise such a meeting as part of a story. But ironically, when the director writes her into the script on a whim, this magic is no longer there. This is partly because of Yuri being unable to create the same natural state of surprise, but it's also a matter of Rikyo's perspective. It's as though for him, a natural connection can only happen in front of the camera. But it's impossible for such a thing to seriously manifest because everything through the lens has to be scripted. And then once Yuri is removed from the script once more, she reaches another natural extreme, a dramatic state. In her suicide attempt, all eyes are on her, enraptured by her, much as they were when she interrupted filming. In this way, she's a mirror of Rikyo. She lives in the real world, not in front of the camera, but wishes for the opposite to be true. While Rikyo doesn't quite wish for a different life, it's evident how detrimental his state of being is for him. It's fitting that the Yuri incident is bookended by scenes with Keo in the bedroom. She begins chapter 2 by mocking the exaggerated demure of an actress kissing Rikyo in a previous film, and she ends it by doing the same with the painful convulsions of Yuri. As well as demonstrating a deeply spiteful and callous attitude by mocking a dying girl, Keo serves to show that perhaps she's not immune to jealousy. She directs her acidic gaze to women who've garnered Rikyo's attention, and she is indiscriminate as to whether their actions are in front of or behind the camera. The Yuri incident is also a sign of the increasing influence of the concept of death into the story, which will only grow as it goes on.
It's useless trying to explain what it's like in the spotlight. The very thing that makes a star spectacular is the same thing that strikes him from the world at large and makes him an outsider.
The third chapter begins with Rikyo thinking about Yuri again. He replays the scene of her convulsing in pain over and over in his mind. The Yuri on that table is, to him, a wholly different one than the girl who was in front of the camera. He describes her display of agony, all eyes in the room locked on her, with a certain admiration.
Her success was absolute, a success that no one could contest. I wanted to study her, to watch her do it all over again. She'd managed to attain the sublime state that actors always dream of. That two-bit actress had really pulled it off, without even knowing that she'd done it.
Rikyo talks about receiving a fan letter from a teenage girl who confesses to touching herself over a picture of him. Keo mercilessly makes fun of her. Internally, though, Rikyo much prefers this kind of sentiment to fans actually approaching him.
Real love always plays out at a distance.
Back at the studio, he's approached by a producer who tells him his popularity is growing. Soon they're going to have him starring in a film a month. He can't wait, he replies. He talks about the process of filming out of order, how for one scene he might be in serious pain from a wound, and the next miraculously healed. Living through this jumping in time day to day is affecting his ability to process time, actions, and consequences in reality. He talks about a rare afternoon off from filming. While shopping, he sees a man being arrested for shoplifting, who had emerged from the crowd gathered to see him.
It felt like we were in a dream. A star and a shoplifter is each a rare encounter, but seeing us together cracked the superstructure of reality.
In that moment, their eyes meet, and he sees agony in the shoplifter's face. He's a middle-aged man, and Rikyo becomes convinced that he is him, only 20 years older.
The moment he reached out to touch those handsome cufflinks with their precious stones, reality began to slip away, and he and I switched places. The next shot in the scene was rolling, only he was playing me.
The store manager apologizes to Rikyo for the trouble and invites him to the store's back office to browse the stock in private. He's left there alone by the manager and looks out of the window to see music and dancing in a cabaret hall next door. It feels like a totally alien world to him. In that moment, Rikyo is running an expensive necktie through his fingers. Impulsively, he slips it into his pocket, but when he hears the manager coming back up the stairs, he returns it to its box.
Even if I'd really stolen it, no one would have labeled me a thief.
Back on set, they're filming a bedroom scene, and the young actress opposite Rikyo keeps messing up her part, so they're doing many takes. Between one of these takes, he shouts down to Keo to bring him his mints. Keo's sitting quietly, not speaking to any of the crew. Though it's summer, she's knitting a sweater. She knits it badly on purpose so that it's ill-fitting and ugly. She draws quiet laughter from the people around her, but she persists with it.
Because I knew what she was up to, that half-finished turquoise sweater seemed to me, from my vantage in the loft, like the very hue of her nefarious intentions. Her fingers maneuvered through the heart of it, as if secretly laboring to humiliate every worldly convention that the climate and seasons had to offer.
She brings Rikyo the mints. He always takes one before they perform a kissing scene. He notes that her face is forever stern and blank on set, without even a trace of jealousy. But this time the scene has no kiss, he's just messing with Keo. He tells her he's also thirsty. She says she'll bring him some tea, flashing him a look of resentment that sees through him just for a second. He jokes that they should have tea just the two of them, and winks at her. At that moment, the casting director passes by and laughs.
We cut that one a little too close.
Chapter 3 continues in much the same vein, with many of the same themes as the first two, but develops a story with an interesting encounter with a shoplifter. Yet again, Rikyo has a brush with something real, some kind of true human experience, but is only able to rationalize it through the lens of a story. He does seem to have some knowledge of this, as he ties it directly to the day-to-day practice of filming scenes out of order, messing with his conception of cause and effect. The most interesting and unlikely aspect of the encounter, however, is the fact that Rikyo actually identifies with the shoplifter. He becomes convinced that somehow this is an older version of himself. In attempting to use the cover of the crowd to steal unnoticed, he's inadvertently drawn all eyes to himself as he's arrested. When his eyes meet Rikyo's, there's agony in them. This man wanted to be unseen and is now seen. Another mirror of Rikyo. His identification with the shoplifter shows at least a hint of some desire to escape from the unceasing gaze of the world. And when he finds some escape, when taken to the store's back office and left alone, he looks out of the window, across the street at the cabaret bar, and feels a touch of sadness that is a completely different world to his. He thinks of stealing the necktie in his hand, but stops short of doing so. He's not the shoplifter. He can't go unseen. He says that nobody would actually think he'd stolen it. The item would simply be credited to the studio's accounts. With no consequences for that action, and with the world's gaze reaching to him even in this way when he's alone, it's uncertain if he could ever really achieve that kind of real experience. The third chapter also develops Rikyo and Keo's relationship. The sweater she's knitting is a perfect symbol of how she sees her place in the world. It's out of season and done badly, purely to spite the world, even the very convention of seasons. And we see for once a scenario in which Rikyo actually exercises his power over her, getting her to wait on him with breath mints. This acting out of their roles in public prevents her from showing her annoyance openly, but there is a tinge of animosity between the two in this interaction. Ultimately, it's becoming clear that there is a very thin, perhaps even non-existent line between acting and reality for Rikyo. Rikyo talks about a tradition he's made for himself while filming. He pins up the life-size poster of his latest project right inside the door of his home. Every night he comes home to be greeted by his own silhouette. He says seeing this perfectly sculpted version of himself makes him feel less exhausted, knowing he was equally exhausted when the picture was taken. The crew is shooting the final scene, where Rikyo sits opposite his character's love interest in a rowboat on a lake. The film ends ambiguously, with the young Yakuza giving up his life of crime but still being followed by the police. He says that though the film is incredibly generic, the ending feels fitting. On lunch break, a journalist from a magazine invites him to an interview over a meal at a restaurant. She has to squeeze through crowds of fans to join him at the bar. After concluding her questions, she sighs and tells Rikyo that she feels bad for him.
Plenty of stars would fall for this sort of line. They're tired of simply being adored or envied, and are quick to take a sign of sympathy as proof of being understood. Not me. All she would get from me is a naive young celebrity, complacent with his fame. When she stood up to go, Ko, who'd been eating sushi beside me, started coughing in the most believable way, and sent 2 or 3 beads of rice flying at the woman's back.
Even though shooting had only wrapped the previous day, the studio already has production for a new film begun the next. This next film is a romance set in high society, and as preparation for the role, the producer takes Rikyo along to a party hosted by a former prince at his palace. The producer parades Rikyo around the function, introducing him to everybody he can.
I'd never had so many people fail to recognize me. Somehow no one knew my name, and the elegant young ladies claimed to have never seen my films. The second we were introduced, they resumed their conversations.
On the way home in the car, the producer's scathing about the snobbishness of higher society. Rikyo's mind, though, is drawn back to one particular interaction at the party. He was introduced to a beautiful young woman, who ever so slightly tilted her neck upon seeing him.
If she really didn't know my name, custom would have kept her from betraying it with such a gesture. Tilting her neck like that, so elegantly you could almost miss it. She knew what she was doing. But I wasn't going to fall for it. I bet she thought pretending that she'd never heard of me was certain to entice me. Most stars would take the bait. Not me.
Back at the studio, Rikyo is taking a walk around the grounds in between dubbing and editing work on the final cut of the Yakuza film. By the gatehouse, he's swarmed by fans asking for autographs. He's so tired that he can barely manage it. As a multitude of hands are thrust in his face, he thinks of death. That night in the bedroom, he tells Ko that he wants to die. She scoffs, points to the room's metal fan, and tells him to stick his head in there and get it over with if he's serious. He says the whir of the fan and its cool current of air makes time feel as in that unusual flow in front of the camera, the only place where he feels comfortable. Ko tells him that because he's young and at the height of his fame, if he died tomorrow people might love him even more. She says if he does, she'll write a memoir revealing their secret to the world. He says he'll enjoy watching the world shock from beyond the grave. At this point, she slides over to him while he's laying on the sofa. He tells her to get off him, that he wants to die. She replies with a long monologue.
Of course you do. Who wouldn't with a life like this? So go ahead and die. But listen, Rikyo, it has to be an accident. Something that catches you totally off guard. If you're thinking about dying in some fantastic blaze of your own making, forget about it. Has the gaze of reality you're so fixated on finally started getting to you? Do you want to be human now like everybody else? Stop being so predictable. The real world can't wait for you to die. Maybe for me too. That's its plan. It wants to cleanse the planet by eradicating everything that contradicts its vision. Consider why you're still alive. This power you get out of being seen is just a way of playing by reality's rules and doing what they ask of you. In exchange, they let us have our secret life together, our passionate artifice, and especially the faith behind the artifice, because they know that a convincing sense of reality can only be born from an unholy faith. For a star, being seen is everything. but the powers that be are well aware that being seen is no more than a symptom of the gaze. They know that the reality everyone thinks they see and feel draws from the spring of artifice that you and I are guarding. To keep the public pacified, the spring must always be shielded from the world by masks, and these masks are worn by stars. But the real world is always waiting for its stars to die. If you never cycle out the masks, you run the risk of poisoning the well. The demand for new masks is insatiable. If you want to stay new in the eyes of the world, do what I say. Run this mystic vein, scorn the real world, curse it with all your heart, but trust the artifice. To put it in more human terms, don't ever lift a finger. From the moment I first saw you, I knew that you could take it.
In the fourth chapter, events seem to speed up. Shooting comes to a close, Rikyo is interviewed for a magazine, and he attends a party in the palace. But all these events are indistinct and completely secondary to his internal world. The key aspect of this world that this chapter gives us is Rikyo's fragility. His usually solid self-image gives way to blatant insecurity. He faultlessly maintains his studio-approved image during his interview with the magazine journalist in the restaurant, both because of his dedication to his role, but also to resist the manipulation he perceives in what she tells him, that she feels sorry for him. It could very well be an interview tactic. Regardless, the woman makes herself a victim of Keio's spite for her efforts to connect with Rikyo. But the key moment of fragility is at the party. He simply cannot and does not believe that so many people could not have heard of him. So much so that when the beautiful young girl, who is an heiress or some other member of high society, tells him the same thing, he takes something so small as an imperceptible tilting of her neck as the cue of a lie. But he's told us, openly and condescendingly, that the films he makes are constructed from mediocrity. The story of the young Yakuza and his romance are stories we've heard 1,000 times before. It's quite clear that as much as Rikyo might have some justification in calling himself the king of his world, the world before the camera, he's excruciatingly ignorant of that world's limitations. Here we see Rikyo read injury against him in the slightest social cues. So is the interview not just another case of that? Does he assign intentions onto others that he can quietly act against, just so that in some small way he feels he has control? Is he not an overworked pawn worth feeling sorry for? In both of these situations, Rikyo refuses to take his adversary's bait, and behaves as he thinks a real star should do. This obsession with self-image is reflected in the motif at Chapter 4's opening. The life-size poster of himself hung on the wall of his home, just inside his door. The need to maintain this perfect form confronts him in every single situation, and just serves to heighten his insecurity. The creeping influence of death in the story comes to a head as Rikyo finally articulates his desire for it. He cannot articulate his misery as a result of his lifestyle or of his stardom, as he has a total dependency on them. Instead, he sees it as desire for death. This he's sure of. He even resists Keio's dismissal of his thoughts when he tells her his desire for death. She shuts him down just as she dismisses the world around them, by making fun of him. Callously, she tells him to get it over with. When he moves against her desires, demonstrating thinking not in keeping with the continuation of their charade, the life that she's constructed for them, she treats him just like anybody else. And then, coldly and articulately, her monologue displays that she's rationalized his role in the world just as much as he has, and she uses this to persuade him to stay trapped in the circumstances that are draining him of life. It's not just their relationship that's at risk for Keio should Rikyo give up his stardom, but her job and her opportunity to spite the world itself. More than ever, it feels as though Rikyo is entrapped by his stardom. The final and shortest chapter of Star takes us back to the studio. It's a spring day, but the sun is harsh enough to feel like summer, and Rikyo is getting a haircut. He's battling sleep even in the bright morning light of the barber shop. His head is hazy. He thinks of Ko, who's having a meeting with the PR office elsewhere on the studio grounds.
If I couldn't say for sure that Ko was at the PR office, could I be sure that she existed? What if she wasn't actually anywhere?
His thoughts continue in this vein till he falls into a deep sleep in the barber's chair. He's woken by Ko's voice in his ear. She tells him that Kokura is here. Kokura is a legendary older film star who Rikyo describes as the original lady killer. He jumps up to greet him. Kokura is superlatively handsome even into his 50s, but in the bright light the cracks are beginning to show.
He was a living god, male beauty sublime, incapable of doing wrong, but he'd committed one great sin, the sin of growing old.
Without the help of makeup and camera angles, there's no hiding the creases in his face, the subtle wrinkles, and the fading of the light in his eyes.
His handsome face had become a dingy plaque, placed to hang a mask, the mask of the handsome face that he'd lost. I was struck by an unfathomable terror and looked back into the mirror.
Rikyo stares into the mirror, and Ko steps into the frame. She brings her lips to his ear, and her silver teeth flash in the light.
Even when you're 60, I'm still going to call you my handsome prince.
Star's closing chapter is a denouement, a climbing down from the climax of chapter 4. Despite his longing for death, Rikyo still goes about the motions of his paper-thin existence, more exhausted than ever. And in Kokura, we see perhaps the true version of Rikyo's future. Though undoubtedly through the same means as Rikyo himself, Kokura maintains his good looks and impeccable image on screen, carrying on in an existence under the all-consuming gaze of the world has its price. The cracks show to such an extent that Rikyo sees his face as just a place to hang a mask. As Ko had said to him in the bedroom, people tire of the old masks, and they must be replaced by new ones. And in that moment, Rikyo feels the deep terror that this is what is awaiting him. A whole life lived as merely a vessel for the masks for the world to gaze at. He knows that he's destined to commit the same great sin as Kokura. And as ever, Ko is right there beside him, to calm his thoughts and plant that gentle whisper in his ear, that he will always be hers. To reach a definitive conclusion on what we can take from the overall story of Star is difficult. As with every Mishima story, Star is complex, deeply introspective, and touches on the darkest corners of the subjects it tackles. We're shown a warped glimpse of the world of film in 1960s Japan. It's evident from the beginning that Rikyo's existence is wholly detached from everyday reality. Whether we can trust Rikyo as a truthful narrator of the events of the story is doubtful. He's never not playing a role. He goes through life like a waking dream. We know that he barely sleeps and spends all his days on set, his brief respite from work only coming in the hours of darkness. And even then, when he's home, he can't escape his stardom, as he's greeted by his own gaudy movie poster hanging next to the front door, and fans waiting outside his bedroom window. He's constantly under the gaze of others. His worldview rests on his conviction that he's somehow special, somehow different from everyone around him, for being able to stand up to that gaze unfailingly, a belief that Ko echoes in her long monologue in the bedroom. And yet he finds that gaze to be withering, but still he depends on it. His only solution is to long for death. Rikyo's life is so far removed from any semblance of normal human relationships and emotion that there seems to be no capacity for any kind of validation except the one he gets from the camera. And that, evidently, is destroying him, even as he convinces himself otherwise. This is reflected in his relationship with his fans. He's utterly idolized by them and yet shows complete contempt for them, perhaps even hatred. But still, he's obsessed with presenting the image expected of him to their gaze, of gaining his reality from who they think he is. It's uncertain exactly who holds the power in this dynamic. The same, even more so, can be said for his relationship with Keo. Keo in many ways plays a role and resists the world just like Rikyo, but she feels much more of a leader than an accomplice. Her presence is caustic, and though quiet and unassuming in public, any thoughts she shares regarding another person to Rikyo in the bedroom are universally malicious and cruel. As he says, she's probably the better actor. But he laughs, every time, even when she mocks Yuri's near death, when Rikyo can't clear the thought of her from his mind, outwardly he partakes in her meanness. In the final chapter at the studio, she's busy meeting with the PR office while Rikyo gets his haircut. We have no idea how much power she really has over him professionally. At the beginning and the end, Rikyo is looking into mirrors, and the image of Keo's face joins him there. She is literally and figuratively ever present in his reality and his conception of things. She's yet another argument, despite Rikyo's conviction in his omnipotence before the camera, that he is merely a pawn without agency, being moved by many hands. Star is simultaneously closely related to Mishima's own experience of fame and a dramatic heightened reality that shows only the extremes and excesses of it. It should go without saying that here I've just presented my takeaways from Star, but my summary could never replace an independent reading of it. For brevity and to highlight my own feelings about the story, there are parts I've truncated or missed, and doubtless there are details that I might have missed here that I'll find on my next read through. Mishima's books are so dense with vivid description and subtle psychology that they can give you a truly different experience each time you read them. And if you're looking for a place to start, I'd say that Star isn't a bad one. It's short, I read it in a train journey, and a good primer for the themes of death, love, beauty, and intense inner worlds that populate all of his writings. And in the end, this Star is uniquely Mishima's.